My name is William Braun. I'm the Associate Director of Music at the Unitarian Society of New Haven. The congregation served so beautifully by John Marsh in 2019 and 2020. John has written today's sermon, which you will hear later, and he has asked for this particular piece of music as our music for gathering. And he has asked me to do a little bit of explanation as to why he chose it. The St. Gaudens sculpture, still to be seen on Boston Common, inspired Charles Ives, born in Danbury, to write a tone poem for orchestra. We're going to hear an excerpt from it arranged for solo piano. The St. Gaudens in Boston Common is the first of the 3 places in New England by Ives, and the sculpture depicted is called Colonel Shaw and His Colored Regiment, referring to a group of soldiers during the Civil War. You will hear several pieces that were current at the time, most particularly the battle cry of freedom in this piece, but they are broken down and fragmented and sometimes a little difficult to make out entirely. That, of course, is the whole point. This is a memory piece. Ives saw in the sculpture the same sadness, the same sacrifice and determination as opposed to military triumphalism that St. Gaudens saw. Ives wrote a brief poem to accompany the score, and that poem says, "Moving, marching, faces of souls, marked with generations of pain, part freers of a destiny, slowly, restlessly swaying on with you. You images of a divine law carved in the shadow of a saddened heart, of an age and of a nation. Above and beyond that compelling mass rises the drumbeat of the common heart in the silence of a strange and sounding afterglow, moving, marching, faces of souls."
Hi, I'm the Reverend Rali Weaver, and John Marsh was my supervisor in San Francisco from 2003 to 2004, and we've stayed in touch all that time. He gave me a precious dog to care for named Sophia, who died just last year. And John has been inspiration to me. He spoke at my installation here in Dedham, where I've served now for 14 years. As many of you know, John has had a recent setback that was after his May of 2020 massive stroke that damaged his brain. Part of my pleasure in introducing his words this morning is because for a time there was uncertainty about whether we would ever hear him preach again or he would be able to put his thoughts down in a cohesive paragraph. John says his life now gives new meaning to the old adage, if the man had had half a brain, he'd be dangerous. Just what percentage of his formal faculties John now has cannot be said for sure, but I hope that after hearing him, you will agree with me that he has more than enough brains to be dangerous to the narrow thought or lifeless creed, dangerous to any social code that fails to serve the cause of a human need.
Please join in singing our first hymn, Let Freedom Span Both East and West, number 148 in your hymnal. I light our chalice this morning for all the people who are still struggling and working towards progress and peace. And I light our green sanctuary candle for all the ways we strive to be a more sustainable congregation. Please say with me the unison affirmation as is printed in your order of service. Love is the spirit of this church, and service is its law. To dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in freedom, to serve humanity in love is our covenant with each other and with God. I'm going to ring our bell for our intergenerational message and ask our children to pay close attention.
In the spring of 1961, the Reverend Martin Luther King called on people of faith to join him in a march in support of voting rights in Selma, Alabama. Among the hundreds of Unitarian Universalists who answered the call was my friend and colleague, the Reverend Gordon Gibson, I've asked Gordon to share some reflections on his experience at that march, as well as on the tragedy of lives that were cut short there. A memorial triptych is now housed at the Unitarian Universe headquarters in Boston, Massachusetts.
Before the Civil War, people of African descent who were held in slavery in the American South, of course, could not vote. They were not regarded as people. After the Civil War, they were citizens, and black men were allowed to vote for a few years. And then laws and practices were put in place in the South that prevented most black men from voting. This continued for many years. And when the Civil Rights Movement became very active in the South in the 1950s and 1960s, one of the concerns was to return to African Americans the right to vote. That particular struggle became clearest in Selma, Alabama in 1965. In the course of that struggle for voting rights, three people were killed by people who wanted to stop African Americans from getting greater access to voting. We Unitarian Universalists talk a lot about the Reverend James Reeb, who was one of those killed. We also often talk about Viola Liuzzo, who was killed. Both of them were Unitarian Universalists. The killing of Jim Reeb in particular was important in that struggle to get the right to vote. And we need to remember that those two lives that were sacrificed in the effort to get the vote for Black Americans were our co-religionists. But even more than that, we need to remember the first person who was killed in that struggle. His name was Jimmy Lee Jackson. He was a black citizen of Marion, Alabama. 26 years old, a tall, responsible young man, a black man. He was shot, fatally wounded, it turned out, by an Alabama state trooper as he was trying to protect his mother and his 80-some-year-old grandfather from being beaten by police. Jimmy Lee Jackson's death is what led to the attempt to march from Selma to Montgomery, a very famous civil rights event. We need to remember, that particularly those of us who are white, need to remember that the death of that black man, Jimmy Lee Jackson, is what brought white supporters like the Reverend Jim Reeb and Viola Liuzzo to Selma and Montgomery. We need to celebrate and remember our white Unitarian Universalist people who were martyred, Jim Reeb and Viola Liuzzo. But even more, we need to remember that they went to Alabama in support of people like Jimmy Lee Jackson, a black man, trying to protect his family from physical violence, trying to advance the right of them to vote. We need to remember that the right to vote that we take so casually was a life and death matter for black people in the Deep South in the 1960s.
I invite you into a time of prayer and meditation. We will begin with the choir singing our musical meditation. We begin by breathing in peace and breathing out love. Breathing in peace and breathing out love. Let us be grateful for all the silences in our lives so we may more completely experience the sound.
For each child that's born, a morning star rises and sings to the universe who we are. For each child that's born, a morning star rises and sings to the universe who we are. Oh, for each child that's born, a morning star rises and sings to the universe who we are. Oh, for each child that's born, a morning star rises and sings to the universe who we are. We are our grandmother's prayers, and we are our grandfather's dreamings, and we are the breath of our ancestors. We are the Spirit of God. We are mothers of courage, fathers of time, daughters of dust, and the sons of great visions. We're sisters of mercy, brothers of love, lovers of life, and the builders of nations. We're seekers of truth, keepers of faith, makers of peace, and the wisdom of ages. We are our grandmother's prayers. We are grandfather's dreamings, and we are the breath of our ancestors. We are the Spirit of God. We are mothers of courage, fathers of time, daughters of dust, and the sons of great visions. We're sisters of mercy, brothers of love, lovers of life, and the builders of nations. We're seekers of truth and keepers of faith. We are makers of peace and the wisdom of ages. We are our grandmother's prayers. We are our grandfather's dreamings, and we are the breath of our ancestors. We are the Spirit of God. We are our grandmother's prayers, and we are our grandfather's dreamings. We are the breath of our ancestors. We are the Spirit of God. For each child that's born, a morning star rises and sings to the universe who we are. For each child that's born, a morning star rises and sings to the universe who we are. We are one. We are our grandmother's prayers, and we are our grandfather's dreamings, and we are the breath of our ancestors. We are the Spirit of God. We are mothers of courage.
Again, I will say with great pleasure that I have of reading John's words today. Our thoughts and prayers are with John and his family, Allison and Daniel especially, and we know that he's on the mend and we'll be back with them very soon, and I hope to reconnect with him when he returns to Norwell, Massachusetts, which is near my home church. Some religious traditions have their center the story of a divine revelation from God, such as Moses receiving a set of commandments about human behavior, or God appearing in the form of Jesus and delivering a series of teachings. Some believers summarize such an attitude in the bumper sticker, "God said it, I believe it, and that settles it." Unitarian Universalists take a different approach. If we were to summarize this approach in a longer bumper sticker, it might read, "I believe it. Let's talk about it. Maybe someday we'll vote on it." Our tradition rests not on the divine revelation, but on a set of principles arrived at by flawed human beings through a democratic process. This being the way most consistent with human possibilities and limitations to arrive at eternal truths. We are now in the midst of a discussion to add a core principle, citing our need to work to dismantle racism within ourselves and with our larger society. In my sermon this morning, I hope to show that while this principle is a new one, the work of dismantling racism has been an integral part of our movement's history for the past 300 years. Some Unitarian Universalists have bumper stickers on their cars that read, "The most radical thing we can do is introduce people to each other." I agree, but see it as more of a beginning than an end point, and also limited by one's time and place in history. In the 1960s, it seems that the most radical thing many could do was respond to Martin Luther King's call to join him on a march in Selma. As Gordon Gibson has explained, some Unitarian Universalists did that. In the 1860s, it seems the most radical thing that could be done was to put rifles and cannons in the hands of black men and train them to shoot at white men in Confederate uniforms. And while I tell some of the stories in my sermon of Unitarians who did that, who knew that in 2021 Americans would be dragging out flags from the 1860s to express our feelings about current political events? It's odd. But since it's 2020, a 2021 thing, here's my contribution: the battle flag of the Army of the Potomac. I have two blood ancestors who marched and fought under this flag, and a number of my adopted spiritual ancestors, both Unitarian and Universalist, rallied around it. In the interest of full disclosure, I will tell you that I also have one blood ancestor who, when served with notice of conscription, paid $300 to have someone else go in his place, which was legal in 1863. Abraham Lincoln was, it seems, even more desperate for funds to fight the war than he was for volunteers. $300 in 1863 was roughly equivalent to 5,000 of today's dollars, and the ancestor thought that he had more than done his part for the Union. What he had not reckoned on was that he would later have to get along with the brother-in-law who served as a volunteer. According to family lore, the two men made life awkward for anyone who sat between them at Thanksgiving dinners for decades after that war was over. All was mostly smoothed over by the time I was born in 1955, although not entirely forgotten, as is evidenced by my grandmother Marsh's sharing of this story with me as she reviewed some of our family's history of military involvement. I think the lessons of my grandmother intended to impart were: conflict in families is a natural part of life and to be expected. Yet every family is still all important. And within our family military service was an honored tradition, but not necessarily a requirement. So what is required of us as people is that we take up and examine the various strands of history of which we are the rightful inheritors. As our reading said, Some who went before us gave their lives, but until we make up our minds, no one can say what those lives mean. So I would like to spend some of our time this Sunday morning reviewing some of these stories. Some of these stories involve bloody carnage. Let's begin instead with a pleasant romance. John Albion Andrew first set his eyes on Elizabeth Jane Hershey at an anti-slavery fair where she appeared in a tableau, a group of people posing as if in a painting. When he saw Eliza again a few weeks later, sitting amidst the congregation of the New North Unitarian Church in Hingham, Massachusetts, where he frequently attended services, he recognized her and wasted little time in asking her to accompany him on an afternoon walk. Hingham Harbor was and still is a beautiful setting for an afternoon stroll. It has green lawns with a view of small boats bobbing in the harbor, and behind them the whole Atlantic Ocean expanding backwards toward a distant horizon. But back to John Andrew, who became governor of Massachusetts in January of 1861 and was part of a group within the Republican Party considered to be radicals for their stance on abolishing slavery. This group included Senator Charles Sumner and the statesman Frederick Douglass. In the primary season of 1860, Andrew rallied the group to support the candidacy of Abraham Lincoln. After Lincoln's successful election, the same group lobbied Lincoln to end slavery and allow black men to join the Union troops. After Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, Andrew created a number of Massachusetts black volunteer regiments and recruited thousands of men, including 2 of Frederick Douglass's sons, to fill them. Andrew also recruited Robert Gould Shaw to serve as one of the first officers who were all white. As required by military regulations, in the 54th Massachusetts Regiment of Black Men, Shaw hailed from the predominant Bostonian family who were members of Theodore Parker's Unitarian congregation, and his story is told in the 1989 movie Glory, starring Matthew Broderick as Shaw. This morning's prelude is a brilliant adaptation of an orchestral piece commemorating Robert Gould Shaw and the 54th Massachusetts assault on Fort Wagner. South Carolina in 1983, Shaw and almost half of his men died in that battle. In the movie Glory, there is a scene where Lincoln meets privately with some of the black soldiers. Few of them hesitantly tell the president about their concerns that they're not being paid the same rate as white soldiers. Lincoln listens and promises to correct the situation. That is Hollywood's gloss over. The real story is that the black soldiers had been promised the same wages as white soldiers. When they discovered the pay inequity, they refused to accept lower pay. To be clear, they did not go on strike. They simply refused to accept any pay that is at a lower rate. They also refused to offer the offer of John Andrew to make up the pay difference from the Massachusetts coffers. The black soldiers instead insisted that they be paid what they had been promised from the federal government. John Andrew lobbied successfully for equal pay and also used this controversy to promote the advancement of black officers within the Massachusetts regiments. Many 19th century Unitarians were committed to ending slavery and finding a non-violent alternative to war. They came of an age during Napoleonic Wars in Europe. Napoleon invaded most of Europe monarchies under the guise of spreading democracy. then with most of Europe at his feet, crowned himself emperor without even bothering with the old school soft touch of having the Pope preside at his coronation to give the thing a whiff of God's blessing. It was just the sort of thing that gave wars in the name of democracy a bad name. A number of Unitarian Transcendentalists were active supporters of abolitionist John Brown, who dreamed of leading a major slave insurrection after capturing an arsenal of weapons at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. He toured New England to raise support for his Harper's Ferry raid. Emerson and Thoreau, who never met John Brown, made statements after his execution comparing his martyrdom to that of Jesus of Nazareth, and did what they could to support his surviving children. William Ellery Channing had founded the first Peace Society in 1815. Some Unitarian and Universalist men even took up the pacifist Mennonite style of facial hair wearing beards without mustaches to contrast with the style favored by the military men of Europe, of wearing mustaches without beards. When he came out for the abolition of slavery, Channing took pains to argue that slavery was a national problem and that the North and the South should share the burden of abolishing slavery with the South. There exists some controversy among historians about the Transcendentalist support for Brown. Susan Cheever, in her book, American Bloomsbury, says that John Brown deceived and seduced the American Unitarian Transcendentalists of New England. She writes they were betrayed by their own innocence. I respectfully disagree. Saying they were betrayed by their own innocence, Cheever would suggest not only were the Transcendentalists not guilty of wrongdoing, but they could not even recognize wrongdoing committed against them. I believe they were all aware of wrongdoing committed against them. They had raised money to send neighbors to Kansas to vote, to have Kansas enter the Union as a free state, only to learn that some of these friends were murdered by pro-slavery ruffians from Missouri. The New Englanders were feeling helpless and desperate when John Brown arose on the scene to take revenge on the Missourian ruffians. John Brown may not have shared the details of his plans to raid Harper's Ferry when he visited the Transcendentalists and asked for their support, but they knew what kind of man they were dealing with. It is also worth noting some Transcendentalists did not actively support John Brown, including Samuel Joseph May, who studied for the ministry under Channing's direction. In 1851, a fugitive slave was arrested during an annual convention of the Anti-Slavery Liberty Party in Syracuse, New York. May led a group of abolitionists to the jail where they demanded and were granted the release of the prisoner without the use of firearms. If John Brown had really hid his violent intentions, Samuel May might have been among his supporters, but he was not. Two Unitarian ministers, Theodore Parker and Thomas Wentworth Higginson, belonged to a small group of John Brown supporters known as the Secret Six and provided funds to Brown. Higginson was the only one of the Secret Six who openly and publicly supported Brown. In the weeks between his arrest and execution, Brown made a series of statements which electrified the nation. He essentially said that while he was sorry he did not get to kill more slaveholders, it now seemed that everybody had their rifles pointed at each other's throats. So maybe his raid would have a satisfactory outcome after all. Northerners were largely sympathetic to John Brown, while Southerners were outraged by this sympathy. These divergent opinions led fairly directly to the Civil War. In the spring of 1861, Julia Ward Howe accompanied her husband, Samuel Gridley Howe, who was also of the Secret Six, to meetings about the Sanitary Commission of Washington, D.C., the precursor to the American Red Cross. They were in an open carriage with their minister, James Freeman Clarke, amid thousands of troops, when at the edge of the troops there was a skirmish of gunfire. They tried to leave the area, but were blocked in traffic. As they sat there, some of the Union troops marched by singing, "John Brown's body lies moldering in the grave, but his soul goes marching on." Reverend Clarke, knowing that Julia was a published poet, said to her, "What a pity they don't have better lyrics to sing to this splendid tune." That night, Julia wrote the first verses of the Battle Hymn of the Republic. When I think of that song now, my mind first jumps to the satirical verses I learned when in grade school. "Glory, glory, hallelujah, teacher hit me with the ruler." When I continue thinking, however, I'm struck how Howe's genius in using biblical imagery from both the Christian and Hebrew scriptures. And when she speaks of his soul goes marching on, the soul managed to be a synthesis of John Brown, Jesus of Nazareth, and the spirit of freedom itself. In one verse, she refers to Jesus with the words, "As he died to make men holy, let us die to make men free." In today's postmodern world, our best thinkers tell us that concepts of such as freedom and holiness and race itself are merely social constructs, that they have no reality outside of our human imaginations. I agree, but also say that we live and die by the possibilities and limitations of human imaginations. I would have us remember that for those held in slavery, freedom was as tangible as the iron chains sometimes put around their hands and feet. And even today, freedom as tangible as a padlocked prison door where Black men are housed in disproportionate numbers. As Martin Luther King Jr. said, our work for freedom must march on. Our work for prison reform marches on, and our work to expand our democracy by pushing back against voter suppression and working to recognize Washington, D.C. as a state. This spirit of freedom will march on, but only if we embody it. So I ask you, brothers and sisters, to let the spirit of freedom march on in your lives. I want to thank the Reverend John Marsh for these words and the privilege of being able to speak them for him.
words of our benediction are by William Ernest Hawking. The courage to belong. There is no choice but to immerse oneself in the stream of history, accept one's time and location. Breathe in with shared memories and hopes. The contamination of tradition. Become defined as the person of this cause, this party, this emergency. Failure to accept responsibility, refusal to take stands on vital issues, as one must project the false tags of the ties of a true belonging. These are denials of life. They are, in fact, deeds of death. To understand the times in which we live, to add our weight to the scales on the side of solidarity and equality with invalid difference. This is life with shape and character, the one eternity worth having. Blessed be.
Lift every voice and sing to the heavenly, ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise, high as the listening skies. Let it resound, loud as the rolling sea. Sing a song full of the faith that the dark past has taught us. Sing